On October 6, 1789, a crowd gathered at the gates of Versailles. Thousands of them, mostly women. They'd walked from Paris through rain and mud, carrying pikes, kitchen knives, whatever weapons they could find. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were done waiting. Inside the palace, the royal family heard the noise, the shouting, the pounding on doors, the sound of a crowd that had stopped asking permission. Marie Antoinette was rushed to the king's chambers. Guards barricaded hallways. For hours they waited, listening to the mob outside grow louder, bolder, closer. This wasn't supposed to happen. Versailles was built to prevent exactly this, a palace so magnificent, so overwhelming in its power and beauty, that it would make the monarchy untouchable. Louis XIV had spent decades creating it. Billions in today's money poured into gold leaf and marble and fountains that never stopped flowing. The most powerful palace in Europe, a symbol of absolute authority. And now, barely a century later, a crowd of Parisian market women had walked right up to its gates, and the guards didn't know what to do. Because the palace that was meant to protect the monarchy had done the opposite. It had made them visible. It had made them vulnerable. It had turned royal wealth into evidence of everything wrong with France. This is the story of how the most spectacular palace ever built became a liability. How a building designed to project strength ended up revealing weakness. How luxury meant to inspire awe created rage instead. Versailles didn't just cost money, it cost legitimacy. It cost trust. Eventually, it cost the monarchy everything. The palace was supposed to make the king eternal. Instead, it made him visible. And once people could see clearly, they stopped believing in the magic. Louis XIV had a problem. It was 1661. He was 23 years old, and he'd just watched his chief minister die, the man who'd actually been running France while Louis wore the crown. Now, the young king was in charge, and he understood something his nobles didn't think he'd figured out yet. Paris was dangerous. Not dangerous like enemy armies dangerous. Dangerous like your own aristocrats dangerous. The kind of danger that comes from having hundreds of wealthy, ambitious nobles living in a city where they can meet in secret, form alliances, plot against you. The kind of danger that had nearly destroyed the monarchy during Louis's childhood, the Fronde. That's what they called it. A series of civil wars when Louis was a boy. Nobles rebelling against royal authority. Paris turning into a battlefield. The royal family forced to flee in the middle of the night, running from their own people. Louis was 10 years old when he had to escape Paris, because aristocrats and common people alike wanted to limit his power, maybe overthrow his mother's regency entirely. He never forgot it. Never forgot the humiliation. Never forgot that Paris, with its narrow streets and its crowds and its nobles, gathering in their private mansions, was a place where the king couldn't control what happened. You can't surveil people who live in their own homes scattered across a city. You can't control nobles who can meet privately, plan privately, act against you before you even know what they're doing. So Louis decided to solve the problem. Not by crushing the nobles, though he could have tried. Not by moving to a different established palace, which wouldn't have changed the dynamic. He was going to build something new. Something unprecedented. A palace so magnificent that nobles would want to be there. A court so elaborate that participating in it would become their full-time occupation. A system that would pull power away from Paris and concentrate it in one place where he could see everything. He chose Versailles, a hunting lodge his father had built, nothing special, sitting in empty land about 11 miles southwest of Paris. Far enough from the city that nobles couldn't easily maintain their Paris mansions and their Versailles presence simultaneously. Close enough that it was clearly the center of French power, the perfect location for what he had in mind. Construction started in 1661 and didn't stop for decades. Louis poured money into it, unbelievable amounts of money. Estimates suggest the palace cost something equivalent to $2 billion or more in today's currency. Maybe significantly more depending on how you calculate it. That's just construction, not the ongoing costs, not the maintenance, not the endless expansions and updates. The architect was Louis Laveau initially, then Jules Ardouin-Mansart took over and expanded everything. The gardens were designed by André Lenotre, who created landscapes on a scale nobody had attempted before. Hundreds of fountains, geometric patterns visible from the palace windows that stretched to the horizon. The garden budget alone could have funded a small country. But Louis didn't care about the cost, he cared about the effect. Versailles was being built to do something no building had done before. It was a weapon, not a military weapon, a political one. The palace was designed to trap the aristocracy. Here's how it worked. Louis made Versailles the only place that mattered. If you were a noble of any importance, you needed to be at court. Not visit occasionally. Be there. Live there if possible, or at least spend enough time that everyone knew you were a presence. Because the king decided everything from Versailles. Appointments to office, military commands, pensions, favors, benefits. Every form of advancement came through proximity to the king. And the king was at Versailles. So if you wanted anything, you had to be at Versailles too. You had to be seen. You had to participate in court life. You had to be part of the system. Louis made access to himself the most valuable commodity in France. And he controlled that access completely. You couldn't demand to see the king. You couldn't show up at the palace and expect an audience. Everything went through court protocol. Through the elaborate rituals Louis established. The morning routine alone was a masterpiece of control. The king's lever, his rising ceremony, involved dozens of people. Different nobles had the privilege of handing him different items of clothing, the honor of holding the candle while he got out of bed, the right to stand in the room during different phases of dressing. These weren't jobs. They were status markers, signs that you were important enough to be near the king during his private moments. Sounds ridiculous now. Grown men competing for the honor of watching another man put on his shirt. But it was brilliant, because it made proximity to the king the measure of success. And proximity was something Louis could grant or withhold at will. You pleased him, you got access. You displeased him, you were frozen out, and everyone was watching everyone else. That was the other critical element. Versailles wasn't just about the king watching the nobles, it was about the nobles watching each other. Court life was a performance. Who you talked to mattered. Who acknowledged you mattered. Where you stood in a room mattered. What you wore mattered. Every social interaction was laden with meaning. The palace itself was designed to facilitate this surveillance. The Hall of Mirrors, completed in 1684, was 240 feet of reflective surfaces and windows. You couldn't move through that space without being seen from multiple angles. The galleries and antechambers created paths where people naturally encountered each other. There were no private spaces except locked bedrooms. Everything else was public. This constant visibility meant no one could relax. You were always performing, always aware that a misstep could be noticed, always conscious that your status was being evaluated. It was exhausting. It was intentional. Because exhausted nobles competing for favor don't have energy left over for plotting rebellion. Louis understood something profound about power. You don't maintain control by building bigger armies, though he did that too. You maintain it by making the people who could threaten you dependent on you, by giving them something they want more than independence, status, recognition, access, the feeling of being important. Versailles offered all of that, but it demanded total participation. You couldn't be half in. You couldn't maintain your old power base in Paris while occasionally showing up at court. The system required commitment. And once you committed, once you reoriented your life around court favor, you were trapped. Because leaving meant losing everything. Your status evaporated the moment you were no longer visible at court. The king's favor was conditional on presence. No presence, no favor. No favor, no advancement. No advancement, no future. The nobles, who'd once been independent power centers, who'd controlled their own regions and their own followers, became courtiers. Their power now derived from the king's approval rather than their own resources. And that was the point. Louis XIV transformed the French aristocracy from potential threats into an audience. They weren't governing their territories anymore. They were attending the king's coucher, his bedtime ceremony. They weren't commanding private armies. They were competing for invitations to royal hunts. They weren't plotting rebellions. They were obsessing over whether the king had smiled at them that morning. Versailles didn't just display power, it created a system that made opposing power seem unthinkable. Because who would risk losing their position at court? Who would gamble their status on rebellion when rebellion meant exile from the only place that mattered? The palace was a golden cage, beautiful, comfortable if you could afford it, and absolutely inescapable once you entered. Louis XIV had built a trap that the aristocracy walked into willingly, and once inside, they discovered they couldn't leave. The addiction started small: an invitation to a royal event, a smile from the king, a brief conversation, permission to stand in a particular location during a ceremony. These tiny acknowledgments of status felt good. They felt important, because, at Versailles, they were important. The court operated on a hierarchy so complex that entire lifetimes were spent navigating it. Your rank determined everything: where you sat at dinner, whether you could sit at all or had to stand, which rooms you could enter, what time you could enter them, who could speak to you, who you could speak to. Every interaction was governed by rules that everyone understood but were rarely written down. The king was at the top, obviously. Then his immediate family, then the princes of the blood, relatives with hereditary claims, then dukes and peers, then lesser nobility in descending order of title and favor. Where you fit in this hierarchy determined your entire existence at court. And here's what made it brilliant. The hierarchy wasn't just based on birth. Birth mattered, but favor mattered more. A minor noble who pleased the king could outrank a duke who'd fallen from grace. This meant everyone, regardless of how high they started, needed to constantly maintain and improve their position. The daily routines became rituals of status competition. The king's lever each morning was attended by those with the privilege. Different levels of access granted different levels of prestige. To be admitted to the petit lever, the small rising ceremony with just a few intimate attendees, marked you as truly favored. To only make it to the grand lever with dozens of others meant you were important but not special. The same applied to meals. The king ate in semi-public most of the time. Being invited to dine with him was a massive honor, but even among those invited, hierarchy applied. Proximity to the king at table, quality of conversation he directed toward you, whether he offered you food from his own plate. These microscopic gradations of favor consumed people's attention. Hunting parties, concerts, plays, gambling nights, every entertainment was simultaneously an entertainment and a status evaluation. Who was invited? Who sat where? Who the king spoke to and for how long? Observers watched and noted everything. Your standing could rise or fall based on a single evening. The ceremonies around the king's daily routine were particularly elaborate. He woke publicly. He ate publicly. He went to bed publicly. Each moment choreographed, each role assigned to specific people with specific privileges. Holding the king's shirt while he dressed was a job for high nobility. Opening the curtains in the morning went to someone else, handing him his hat, his cane, his gloves. Each task carried prestige. And these weren't just honors. They were opportunities. Moments of proximity when you might say something the king remembered, when you could demonstrate loyalty, wit, usefulness. Every second near Louis XIV was a chance to advance. So nobles competed desperately for these positions that looked absurd from outside but felt crucial from within. The competition extended to appearance. Versailles demanded constant performance, and performance required costumes. The elaborate fashions of the French court, the wigs and powders and silk and lace, weren't just about beauty. They were signals. Your clothing announced your status, your wealth, your taste, your awareness of what was currently fashionable. And fashion changed constantly. What was acceptable one season was outdated the next. The king's mistresses and the queen set trends. Everyone else scrambled to follow. A noble who appeared in last season's style looked poor or worse, out of touch. So wardrobes had to be constantly updated, new outfits commissioned, new jewels acquired. The expense was staggering. Historians estimate that maintaining a presence at Versailles required income far exceeding what most noble families possessed. They had lands, titles, hereditary incomes, but those traditional sources of wealth couldn't fund court life. The cost of appropriate clothing alone could bankrupt lesser nobles. Add housing in Versailles or nearby, transportation, servants, gifts, gambling losses, and the expenses became impossible. So nobles went into debt, borrowed money, begged the king for pensions and grants, married for money rather than alliance, anything to stay at court. Because leaving was unthinkable. Leaving meant admitting you couldn't afford it, that you weren't important enough, that you'd failed. The king understood this dynamic perfectly. He encouraged the spending. When nobles requested pensions to cover their Versailles expenses, he often granted them. Not out of generosity, out of calculation. A noble in debt to the king was a loyal noble. A noble dependent on royal pensions couldn't afford to oppose royal policy. Louis XIV supposedly said he could tell the difference between a nobleman who lived in Paris and one who lived at court. The court noble was poorer, constantly scrambling for money, but also more loyal, more controllable, more useful. The Paris noble retained independence but lost influence. That was the trade. The psychological effect was profound. Nobles who'd once seen themselves as peers of the king, who'd ruled their own territories with minimal interference, now measured their worth by whether the king had noticed them that morning. Men who commanded armies in the field obsessed over seating arrangements at dinner. Women who managed vast estates spent fortunes on dresses for a single evening. It sounds like madness. It was madness, but it was calculated madness that served Louis's purpose. Every hour nobles spent worrying about court favor was an hour they didn't spend building power bases that could challenge him. Every franc they spent on Versailles was a franc they couldn't spend on private armies or fortifying their chateaux. The physical layout of the palace reinforced this system. Versailles could house about 5,000 people at its peak, though not comfortably. Nobles lucky enough to have rooms in the palace proper treasured them, even though the rooms were often tiny, poorly heated, lacking privacy. Having an apartment at Versailles meant you were important. It meant constant access. It meant you couldn't be forgotten. Those without rooms in the palace had to find housing nearby. The town of Versailles exploded as courtiers bought or rented whatever they could find. Even a small house within walking distance of the palace cost more than a noble's entire annual income from their estates. But they paid it, because absence was death. The system created a closed loop. Nobles needed to be at Versailles to maintain status. Being at Versailles required spending money they didn't have. They went into debt and became dependent on royal favor to cover debts. That dependence made them loyal. Their loyalty gave the king more power. More power meant he could demand more from them, which required more spending, which created more dependence. It was a machine that ran on aristocratic wealth and ambition. And it worked perfectly. For a while. The nobles who might have challenged royal authority were too busy competing with each other for scraps of royal approval. They'd traded independence for invitations, power for proximity, and they thought they were winning. But there was a catch. The machine had to keep running. The spectacle had to continue. Because the moment it stopped, the moment the show paused, nobles might look around and realize what they'd given up, might notice they'd become dependent on a system that exploited them. So Louis couldn't slow down, couldn't cut back, couldn't ever let Versailles feel less than overwhelming. The palace had to expand, the ceremonies had to grow more elaborate, the court had to pulse with constant activity. Because Versailles wasn't just a building, it was a spell. And spells break when you stop believing in them. The machine Louis XIV built at Versailles ran on gold. Not metaphorically, literally. Gold leaf covered everything. The ceilings, the furniture, the frames around mirrors and paintings, the gates, the statuary. Thousands upon thousands of sheets of gold hammered so thin they barely existed, then applied to surfaces by craftsmen who spent lifetimes perfecting the technique. The Hall of Mirrors alone consumed wealth that could have funded a war. 17 mirror-clad arches, each containing 21 mirrors. That's 357 mirrors total. In the 1680s, mirrors were staggeringly expensive. The glass had to be perfectly clear, perfectly flat, perfectly reflective. Only Venetian craftsmen could make them properly, and Venice guarded the secret jealously. France had to smuggle Venetian mirror makers to France, risking diplomatic incidents, just to get the glass needed for one room. The ceiling of the Hall of Mirrors featured paintings by Charles Le Brun showing Louis XIV's victories. The frames around those paintings were carved and gilded. The chandeliers held hundreds of candles that had to be replaced and lit for every evening event. The parquet floors were works of art in themselves, different woods arranged in geometric patterns that took months to install. And that was one room. The palace had 700 rooms. Not all as elaborate as the Hall of Mirrors, but many trying to compete. Each needed furnishing, each needed decoration, each needed maintenance. The salon of war, the salon of peace, the royal apartments, the queen's chambers, the galleries. Every space was a showcase. Outside, the gardens consumed even more resources. André Lenotre designed landscapes that defied nature. The ground at Versailles was swampy. The soil was poor. None of that mattered. Thousands of trees were transplanted fully grown. If they died, they were replaced. Flower beds were changed seasonally, sometimes more often. The king wanted constant color and perfect arrangements. The fountains were the real madness. Hundreds of them, some small, some massive. The Latona fountain, the Apollo fountain, the Neptune fountain. They were engineering marvels, each fed by a complex network of pipes and pumps. The problem was water. Versailles had no natural water source capable of feeding all those fountains simultaneously, so they built systems to bring water from elsewhere. The Machine de Marly was constructed in the 1680s to pump water from the Seine River. 14 enormous water wheels drove 221 pumps that lifted water over 500 feet in elevation, then pushed it miles to Versailles. The machine was one of the largest constructions of its era. It required constant maintenance. It consumed enormous energy just to operate, and it still didn't provide enough water. The fountains at Versailles never ran all at once except for special occasions. On normal days, gardeners turned on only the fountains the king would see during his walk. When he approached a section, they'd activate those fountains. After he passed, they'd shut them off and prepare the next section. It was theater. Elaborate, expensive theater to maintain the illusion of infinite abundance. The costs weren't just construction and decoration. Staffing the palace required thousands of people: servants, administrators, guards, gardeners, craftsmen, cooks, musicians, pages, footmen. The numbers were staggering. Estimates suggest 10,000 people or more were employed at Versailles during its peak operation. All of them needed wages. All of them needed housing and food. The royal household spending was separated into different budgets. The Maison du Roi covered the king's personal expenses and the core palace operations. The Maison de la Reine handled the queen's establishment. The princes had their own households. Each required funding. Each competed to maintain standards appropriate to their status. Food alone was extraordinary. The king's meals involved dozens of dishes even for routine dinners. Multiple courses, each prepared by specialists. Meat, fish, pastries, vegetables, fruits brought from across France and beyond. The kitchens operated continuously. On feast days or special celebrations, hundreds might dine, requiring production on industrial scales. Wine cellars held thousands of bottles. The king's wine steward was a position of significant importance. Quality mattered immensely. The wrong wine at a state dinner could be seen as an insult to guests or a sign of declining standards, so only the best was acceptable. Only the best of anything was acceptable. Entertainment cost fortunes. Louis XIII loved theater and music. He employed composers like Lully and later Rameau. He commissioned operas and ballets. Molière wrote and performed at Versailles. These weren't small productions. They were elaborate affairs with expensive sets, costumes, professional performers. Some were one-night performances, never repeated, the sets and costumes discarded after a single use. Then there were the festivals. The Grand Divertissement Royal of 1668 lasted for days. Fireworks, boat parades on the canals, theatrical performances, banquets, all for the court and specially invited guests. The cost was never fully calculated, but it was staggering. These weren't celebrations of anything in particular. They were assertions of power, demonstrations that the king could afford to be wasteful. The message was clear. We are so wealthy that extravagance doesn't touch us. We can spend lavishly on a single evening's entertainment because our resources are infinite. Look at what we can do. Imagine what it means to oppose us. But infinity is expensive. Every year, the crown spent more on Versailles. Expansions continued under Louis XIV, then under his successors. Louis XV added new wings. Louis XV's reign saw further modifications. The palace was never finished because finishing would mean stopping, and stopping would break the Ew. Spell. Maintenance was equally endless. Gold leaf tarnished and needed reapplication. Wood paneling warped in humidity and required replacement. Roofs leaked, foundations settled, pipes burst. Tapestries faded and had to be replaced or restored. The gardens needed constant replanting. Statues weathered and needed cleaning or repair. An army of craftsmen worked continuously just to keep the palace from deteriorating. Gilders, painters, glaziers, carpenters, masons, plasterers, upholsterers. The turnover was constant. Sections of the palace were always under renovation. The sounds of construction were background noise. This created a feedback loop that Louis XIV probably didn't fully anticipate. Once Versailles was established as the standard of royal magnificence, it had to be maintained at that standard. Any decline would be noticed. Any reduction in spending would be interpreted as weakness. The crown had set the bar impossibly high and now couldn't lower it without losing credibility. Successors to Louis XIV faced this problem. They'd inherited a palace that required constant infusions of wealth to remain impressive, but they'd also inherited a system where that palace was essential to royal authority. You couldn't abandon Versailles without abandoning the centralizing logic that made it necessary. The aristocracy was there. The government functions were there. Power was concentrated there. So the spending continued, and every year it became more obvious that the costs were unsustainable. The French treasury didn't have unlimited funds, regardless of what Versailles suggested. The money had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was taxation, which meant someone had to pay for all this gold and all these fountains and all these performances. That someone was everyone who wasn't at Versailles. Everyone who would never see the Hall of Mirrors or walk through the gardens or attend a royal ball. They paid. Through taxes that funded a system built to exclude them. Through labor that generated wealth extracted to maintain a palace they'd never enter. The machine of luxury was remarkable. It achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. It trapped the aristocracy. It centralized power. It projected French glory across Europe. It made Louis XV the Sun King, the absolute monarch whose splendor couldn't be matched. But it was also a machine with an appetite, and that appetite would eventually consume everything, including the monarchy itself. The taxes fell hardest on people who had the least. That's not an exaggeration. That's how the French tax system worked. The Third Estate, everyone who wasn't clergy or nobility, paid the overwhelming majority of direct taxation. The clergy paid almost nothing, claiming exemption based on their service to the church. The nobility paid minimal amounts, protected by privileges they'd accumulated over centuries. So the burden landed on peasants and urban workers and the emerging middle class. Farmers working, land they didn't own. Laborers in cities earning subsistence wages, merchants who'd built modest businesses. They paid for Versailles. They funded the fountains and the gold leaf and the festivals. Through taxes they had no say in determining, collected by methods they couldn't appeal, used for purposes that brought them no benefit. The tile was the main direct tax. It hit rural populations especially hard. Assessed based on estimated ability to pay, collected locally, often corrupt in application. Tax collectors took their cut. Local administrators skimmed. By the time money reached the crown, a significant portion had vanished into pockets along the way, but the full burden still fell on those being taxed. Indirect taxes were equally painful. The gabelle, the salt tax, forced people to buy minimum amounts of salt at inflated prices from royal monopolies. Salt was essential for preserving food. You couldn't opt out. You paid what the crown demanded. The customs duties on goods moving between regions made basic commerce expensive. France wasn't a unified market. It was a collection of regions with internal tariffs that benefited the crown while hindering trade. And while taxes climbed, food security was declining. France's agricultural system was inefficient. Most peasants worked small plots or rented land. Farming techniques hadn't evolved much in centuries. Weather variations meant good harvests, and bad harvests alternated unpredictably. A bad harvest meant hunger. A series of bad harvests meant disaster. The 1780s brought exactly that. 1785 saw drought. 1786 was little better. 1788 brought a harsh winter, followed by a spring hailstorm that destroyed crops across large regions. 1789 started with bread shortages in Paris and other cities. Prices for basic foods climbed beyond what poor families could afford. People were hungry, not metaphorically hungry, actually hungry. Bread was the staple food for most French people, and bread was increasingly unaffordable. Workers in cities spent 50%, sometimes 80% of their income on food. When bread prices spiked, they had nothing left for rent or clothing or anything else. Rural areas weren't much better. Peasants ate less, made do with whatever they could find, watched their children suffer. And the entire time, Versailles blazed with light. The court continued its routines. Dinners featured multiple courses. Fashion still demanded new outfits. Festivals still consumed fortunes. The machine of luxury didn't slow down because people were starving. If anything, maintaining the spectacle seemed even more important when everything else was falling apart. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Peasants working land they didn't own, paying taxes on their meager output, going hungry because harvests failed. Urban workers laboring long hours for wages that couldn't buy food. While at Versailles, courtiers competed over seating arrangements and access to the king's bedtime ceremony. The psychological breaking point wasn't just about economic hardship, it was about fairness. For centuries, French society had operated on an implicit contract. The first two estates, clergy and nobility, didn't pay taxes because they served other functions. The clergy provided spiritual guidance and ran charitable operations. The nobility provided military service and administration. The third estate paid taxes in exchange for protection and stability. But that contract was visibly broken by the late 1700s. The clergy was wealthy beyond measure. The Catholic Church owned perhaps 10% of French land and collected tithes on top of that. Charitable work couldn't justify the wealth accumulation. The nobility no longer served primarily military functions. They were courtiers. Their service was attending ceremonies, not defending the realm. So what were the Third Estate paying for? Protection they didn't receive, stability they weren't experiencing, the privilege of funding a system that excluded them, the privilege of watching their children go hungry while the court ate feasts. The pamphlets started circulating, the ideas started spreading. Enlightenment philosophy had been percolating for decades. Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, these thinkers had questioned authority, suggested alternative systems, planted seeds of doubt about divine right and inherited privilege. Their works were technically banned, but widely read anyway, and those ideas found fertile ground in a population that was watching the social contract dissolve. If the king ruled by divine right, why was God allowing people to starve? If the nobility deserved their privileges because of inherent superiority, why did they accomplish nothing but spend money? If the system was just, why did it produce such obvious injustice? People stopped seeing the monarchy as sacred. That shift was crucial. For centuries, the king had been more than a political leader. He was God's representative on earth. Challenging him meant challenging divine order. But when divine order produces starvation, while the anointed king presides over golden palaces, the sanctity starts to erode. Versailles became the symbol of everything wrong. Not because it was uniquely terrible. Aristocracies across Europe lived in luxury while populations suffered. But Versailles was visible, it was concentrated, it was undeniable. You couldn't wave away the excess or claim it was exaggerated. The palace sat there, enormous and expensive, impossible to miss or misinterpret. Every description of Versailles in pamphlets and newspapers reinforced the contrast. While we starve, they feast. While we pay crushing taxes, they're exempt and demand more. While we work ourselves to exhaustion, they perform elaborate rituals about which noble gets to hand the king his shirt. The absurdity was the point. The system was indefensible. The crown tried to respond. There were proposals for tax reform, for making the nobility and clergy pay their share, for restructuring the financial system, for reducing Versailles spending. But every reform attempt hit the same barrier. The privileged estates blocked reforms that would hurt them, and they had the power to block because they controlled key positions. This revealed another crack in the system. Versailles had centralized power, yes, but it had centralized it around a court culture that depended on noble cooperation. The king wasn't an isolated autocrat. He ruled through a network of nobles who administered regions, collected taxes, commanded military units. Those nobles weren't going to accept reforms that diminished their position, so the system was stuck. Can't reduce Versailles spending without undermining royal authority. Can't raise more taxes from the Third Estate without triggering revolt. Can't tax the privileged estates without their cooperation, which they won't give. Can't reform the system without breaking the system. Meanwhile, the debt grew. France had fought expensive wars through the 18th century. The 7 Years' War, the American Revolution support, conflicts with various European powers. Wars are expensive. Wars financed by borrowing are even more expensive because interest accumulates. By the 1780s, interest on debt was consuming roughly half of all government revenue. That's the death spiral. You're borrowing money to pay interest on money you already borrowed. The actual operation of government, defense, courts, administration has to be funded by what's left after interest payments. And what's left isn't enough. So you borrow more, which increases interest payments, which decreases what's available, which requires more borrowing. The people paying for this through their taxes could do the math. They weren't stupid. They understood that the system was broken. They understood that Versailles was continuing as if nothing was wrong while the country bled financially. They understood that the burden would keep increasing until something broke. And they were right. Something was about to break. The spell was weakening. The palace that looked eternal was looking vulnerable. The monarchy that claimed divine authority was looking desperate. The system built on spectacle was about to meet reality. And reality, it turned out, was a crowd of hungry women walking to Versailles through the rain. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." That's important to establish. The quote is almost certainly fabricated, attributed to her by enemies decades after the supposed utterance. But it doesn't matter. Because whether she said it or not, people believed she would say it. That's worse. She arrived at Versailles in 1770 as a 14-year-old Austrian princess married to the future Louis XVI in a political alliance meant to strengthen ties between France and Austria. She was young, naive, thrown into the most complicated court in Europe with no preparation. The French courtiers looked down on her. She was foreign. She didn't understand their intricate social rules. Her French had an accent. She made mistakes constantly. So she did what many young people do when feeling unwelcome. She withdrew, created her own circle, surrounded herself with people who didn't judge her, spent time away from the oppressive formality of court life. None of this would have mattered much except that she was the queen, and queens at Versailles didn't get privacy. Everything she did was visible, her friendships, her spending, her preferences, her daily routine. The court watched, the gossips talked, the pamphlets printed increasingly vicious attacks. And because she was an outsider, an Austrian in a French court, the attacks found audiences willing to believe the worst. Her spending became legendary, though likely exaggerated. She loved fashion. She patronized Rose Bertin, the most famous dressmaker of the era. New outfits constantly, elaborate hairstyles that required hours to construct, jewelry, accessories, everything had to be perfect and current. Her gambling was substantial. Card games with high stakes were court entertainment, and Marie Antoinette lost money regularly. She also spent on her friends, giving them positions, pensions, gifts. The Comte de Polignac and his family received enormous benefits through the Queen's favor. Appointments to sinecures that paid well for minimal work, access to royal funds for various projects. It was standard court behavior. Nobles had always rewarded favorites, but when the Queen did it, the attacks portrayed it as foreign influence corrupting France. The Petit Trianon became her retreat, a small chateau on the Versailles grounds given to her by Louis XVI. She redecorated it to her taste, created gardens around it, built a mock village, the Hameau, where she and her ladies could play at being peasants, dress in simple clothes, feed chickens, pretend they weren't aristocrats. To Marie Antoinette, this was escape. A place where she could relax without constant observation, a chance to experience something approximating normal life. To her critics, it was further evidence of waste and disconnection. While real peasants struggled, the Queen was building a fake village to entertain herself. The money spent on creating an artificial countryside could have fed actual peasants, The pamphlets were vicious. They portrayed her as sexually deviant, as having affairs with both men and women, as controlling the weak-minded king, as spending France into bankruptcy through her extravagance, as being an Austrian spy working against French interests. Most of this was false or wildly exaggerated. None of it mattered, because people believed it, or wanted to believe it. The queen became the symbol of everything wrong with Versailles, with the court, with the monarchy. She was foreign, easy to scapegoat. She was visible, her spending documented. She was female, fitting into existing prejudices about women's irrationality and wastefulness. She was perfect as a villain. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 destroyed whatever reputation she had left. A con artist, Jean de la Motte, convinced a cardinal that the queen wanted an extremely expensive diamond necklace but couldn't ask for it directly. The cardinal, hoping to gain favor, agreed to guarantee payment. The whole thing was a scam. Marie Antoinette knew nothing about it. She didn't want the necklace and never received it, but the public didn't believe that. The story was too perfect. The queen, obsessed with jewelry and luxury, manipulating men to get what she wanted. The trial exposed the details, and Marie Antoinette was eventually cleared, but her reputation was ruined. People were convinced she'd been involved. The stereotype fit too well. From that point forward, every problem in France was somehow the queen's fault. The deficit, Marie Antoinette's spending, the food shortages, her wastefulness, the taxes, funding her extravagance, none of this was economically accurate. The American Revolution support had cost far more than the Queen's personal expenses. The systemic tax inequalities predated her arrival by centuries. But accuracy didn't matter. She was the visible target, and every personal choice she made became political whether she intended it or not. Her preference for simpler fashion was interpreted as rejecting French industry. Her friendship with the Polignacs was seen as undue influence. Her time at the Petit Trianon was portrayed as abandoning duty. Versailles made this worse. The palace was built to make everything visible. The constant observation that controlled the nobles also exposed the royal family. Every action was watched, interpreted, reported. Marie Antoinette couldn't have a private life because Versailles didn't allow private lives. The system that trapped aristocrats also trapped her. And the more she tried to escape that visibility, the worse it looked. The retreat to Petit Trianon appeared to be retreat from responsibility. The simpler life she attempted to create there seemed like mockery of actual simple lives. She was trapped by the very palace that was supposed to protect her. The pornographic pamphlets that circulated in the late 1780s showed how completely her image had collapsed. They portrayed her in graphic detail, engaged in every imaginable sexual act. These weren't political critiques. They were character assassination designed to destroy any remaining respect for the monarchy. If the queen was a debauched whore, how could the king have authority? How could the system have legitimacy? Louis XVI didn't help matters. He was reportedly a good man, well-meaning, interested in reforms. But he was also indecisive, easily influenced, unable to commit to bold action. As the crisis deepened, he vacillated, trying to reform but backing down when faced with resistance, wanting to help his people but unable to force the privileged estates to accept their share of sacrifice. His relationship with Marie Antoinette was fine by most accounts. They had children. They weren't romantically passionate, but they were partners. But their partnership was part of the problem. The queen influenced him, and because she was hated, that influence was seen as corrupt. Foreign influence over a weak king. The Versailles system had made the king's personal life inseparable from political life. Who he talked to, who influenced him, what he did in private, all of it was public business. Marie Antoinette couldn't have an opinion without it becoming a political statement. She couldn't spend money on herself without it becoming evidence of royal excess. By 1789, she'd become the most hated woman in France, more hated than the king, more hated than any particular noble. She embodied everything people despised about Versailles and the monarchy: foreign corruption, wasteful spending, aristocratic indifference to suffering, sexual immorality, the destruction of traditional values. When the crowds eventually came to Versailles, they came for her specifically. They shouted her name as an insult. They demanded her death. She was the target of rage that had been building for years, the perfect symbol of a system that had failed. And the tragedy was that she'd never wanted this role. She'd been a teenage bride thrown into a situation she didn't understand. She'd made mistakes, spent money she shouldn't have, failed to read the mood of the country. But she wasn't uniquely terrible. She was a person of average intelligence and virtue trying to navigate an impossible position. Versailles had built the cage. The court system had set the rules. The propaganda machine had created her image. She was trapped by forces she didn't create and couldn't control. But she would pay the price for all of it. Because when the system collapsed, someone had to be blamed. And the foreign queen who played at being a peasant in her fake village was the perfect scapegoat. The debt numbers were staggering. By 1788, the French government owed approximately 4.5 billion livres. Annual revenue was roughly 500 million livres. Interest payments on the debt consumed about 250 million. That left 250 million to run the entire government, military, administration, courts, roads, everything. It wasn't enough, not remotely enough. Every year the government ran a deficit. Every year they borrowed more to cover the gap. Every year the interest payments grew. The spiral was obvious to anyone who looked at the numbers. France was going bankrupt. The government would soon be unable to borrow, unable to pay even the interest. Default was coming. The finance ministers who followed one another through the 1770s and 80s all saw the problem. They all proposed solutions. Tax reform primarily. Make the nobility and clergy pay. Eliminate some of the exemptions and privileges that let vast wealth escape taxation. Restructure the system to distribute the burden more fairly. And every reform attempt failed. The privileged estates blocked them. The nobility particularly, because they had the most to lose. They sat in the parliaments, the regional courts that had to register royal edicts. They had formal positions that gave them veto power, and they used it repeatedly to stop reforms that would hurt them. The arguments they made were technically about tradition and law. The tax exemptions were ancient rights. The privileges were earned by centuries of service. Eliminating them would violate fundamental laws of the kingdom. But everyone understood the real reason. They didn't want to pay. They had wealth and power and saw no reason to sacrifice either. Jacques Necker was finance minister through much of the 1780s, a Swiss banker, technically foreign, but brilliant with numbers. He understood exactly how bad the situation was. He published reports showing the deficit. He proposed reforms. He tried to reorganize finances to at least slow the bleeding. The court hated him. He was common, bourgeois, didn't understand proper hierarchy. His wife held a salon where ideas were discussed openly, including dangerous Enlightenment concepts. He was replaced in 1781, then brought back in 1788 when the crisis became too severe to ignore. His mere presence was an admission that the system wasn't working. Calonne, finance minister in 1783 to 87, tried a different approach. An assembly of notables in 1787, bringing together nobles and clergy to discuss tax reform. The theory was that face-to-face consultation would produce cooperation. It didn't. The assembly resisted everything. They demanded information. They questioned the extent of the crisis. They absolutely refused to accept taxation of their estates. The deadlock was complete. The crown needed money. The privileged estates had money but wouldn't contribute. The third estate couldn't contribute more without revolution. Something had to change. The question was what? Louis XVI, pushed by advisors, made a fateful decision: call the Estates General. It was an ancient assembly representing all three estates. It hadn't met since 1614. Calling it now was an admission. Admission that the king couldn't solve the crisis alone. Admission that the absolute monarchy couldn't function without cooperation. The Estates General was scheduled for May 1789. The preparations consumed months. Each estate would elect representatives. The third estate would have double the number of delegates they'd had in 1614, though whether votes would be counted by estate or by head remained unclear. That ambiguity would prove critical. The calling of the Estates General created expectations. The third estate expected real representation. expected their voices to matter, expected the privileged estates to finally accept responsibility. The grievance books, the cahiers de doléances, showed what people wanted: tax reform, legal equality, reduction of privileges, some political voice. When the Estates General finally convened at Versailles in May 1789, the symbolism was powerful. Here, at the palace built to concentrate power around the king, representatives of the people were demanding a say. The ceremony of the opening session demonstrated the inequality they were protesting. The Third Estate dressed in plain black. The clergy and nobility wore elaborate traditional costume. The seating arrangements reflected status hierarchy, and immediately conflict erupted. How would votes be counted? If each estate voted separately, the clergy and nobility could outvote the Third Estate 2-1 regardless of numbers. If they voted by head, with all representatives in one assembly, the Third Estate and reform-minded nobles and clergy could potentially outvote the conservatives. The privileged estates wanted separate voting. The Third Estate demanded voting by head. Weeks were wasted on procedural arguments. No actual issues were addressed, just the question of who had power. On June 17th, the Third Estate took decisive action. They declared themselves the National Assembly. Not representatives of one estate, representatives of the nation. They claimed sovereignty. If the king and the privileged estates wouldn't reform, the people's representatives would reform without them. Louis XVI panicked. This was revolution. Constitutional revolution, but revolution nonetheless. He ordered the assembly hall locked. The Third Estate, finding themselves barred, moved to a nearby tennis court and swore the tennis court oath. They wouldn't disperse until France had a constitution. This was the breaking point. Versailles, the palace built to project absolute authority, was the site of the monarchy admitting it had lost control. The National Assembly was meeting on palace grounds, defying the king. And the king couldn't stop them without violence that would spark broader revolt. The army was an option. Troops were concentrated around Paris and Versailles through June and July. Louis XVII could have ordered them to disperse the National Assembly, arrest the leaders, restore order by force. Some advisors urged exactly that. But Louis hesitated. Using soldiers against elected representatives felt wrong, and there was no guarantee the soldiers would obey. Because the crisis had spread beyond Versailles. Paris was volatile. Food prices were still high. Unemployment was rising. Political clubs were forming. Pamphlets circulated constantly. The mood was revolutionary. Attacking the National Assembly might trigger Paris to explode. So, Louis vacillated. Sometimes seemed to accept the National Assembly's legitimacy. Sometimes seemed to prepare for confrontation. The uncertainty made everything worse. Nobody knew what would happen. The Assembly couldn't trust the king's word. The king couldn't control events. Versailles itself became a symbol of indecision, the magnificent palace still running its routines, still maintaining its ceremonies. The court still functioned, nobles still competed for favor, the machine of luxury still operated. But everyone knew it was hollow. The authority was gone, even if the rituals continued. The financial crisis hadn't been solved. The Estates General was supposed to address it. Instead, it had become a constitutional battle. The debt kept growing. Interest kept accumulating. No revenue reforms had passed. The government was still bleeding money. And then July brought violence. The Bastille fell on July 14th. Paris erupted. The symbolism was powerful. The Bastille was a royal fortress, a symbol of arbitrary authority. Parisians stormed it, killed the governor, paraded his head through the streets. The revolution had begun. Word reached Versailles quickly. Louis XVI reportedly asked if it was a revolt. His courtier corrected him. "No, sire, it's a revolution." That anecdote might be apocryphal, but it captures the moment. This wasn't a riot that could be suppressed. It was a systemic collapse. The court at Versailles became a trap. The very system that concentrated power made the royal family visible and vulnerable. They couldn't quietly slip away. Everyone knew where they were. The National Assembly was watching. Paris was watching. Any move would be noticed and interpreted. Some nobles fled, emigrated to other countries where royal authority still seemed secure. The Comte d'Artois, the king's brother, left early. Others followed. The emigration depleted Versailles of some of its most conservative elements, but it also made the ones who stayed look weak, like they'd abandoned France. Marie Antoinette urged Louis to resist, to use force, to reassert authority. But Louis couldn't bring himself to order violence on the scale required. He was a decent man in an indecent situation. Decent men don't command armies to slaughter their own people, but kings sometimes have to. His decency made him indecisive at the moment that required decisiveness. By October 1789, the situation was untenable. The National Assembly was functionally governing. The king had theoretical authority, but no actual power. The debt crisis was unresolved. Food shortages continued. Paris was restive. And then the women marched. They'd had enough. Enough waiting for bread. Enough watching the rich eat while they starved. Enough being told to be patient. Enough of everything. So they walked to Versailles. And when they got there, the palace that was supposed to protect the king became his prison. October 5th, 1789. Early morning, thousands of women, maybe more, start walking from Paris toward Versailles. It began at the markets. Food prices were too high. Bread was scarce. Rumors spread that grain was being hoarded, that aristocrats were stockpiling while the people starved. The women weren't revolutionary leaders. They weren't part of any organized faction. They were market women, working women, poor women who'd reached their limit. They gathered at the Hôtel de Ville, the Paris City Hall, demanding action. When no action came, they started walking. 11 miles from Paris to Versailles, in rain, through October cold, thousands of women. Walking together, some armed with whatever they could carry, pikes, knives, clubs, improvised weapons. They weren't planning a battle, but they weren't going to be turned away either. They arrived at Versailles' gates around evening, muddy, wet, angry, determined. The palace guards didn't know what to do. These were women, not soldiers. But they were also an armed mob. Letting them in seemed dangerous. Attacking them seemed impossible. So the guards did nothing. The women pushed through. They flooded into the palace grounds. They demanded to see the king. They demanded bread. They demanded answers for why France was starving while Versailles ate feasts. Their representatives were eventually allowed into the palace proper. They met with the king. Louis XVI, to his credit, listened. He promised reforms, promised grain would be sent to Paris, promised the bread prices would be addressed. The women weren't entirely satisfied, but it was something. Some started the walk back to Paris, but many stayed, camped in the palace grounds, waiting to see if the promises would be kept. Inside, the court was terrified. This had never happened before. The palace, the symbol of royal power, had been breached, not by enemy armies, by hungry women. The guards could have stopped them with force, but killing French women for demanding food was politically impossible. Marie Antoinette was the primary target of the women's rage. They shouted her name. They called her the Austrian whore. They blamed her for the shortages, for the extravagance, for everything wrong with France. Some apparently wanted her killed. Others just wanted her humiliated. None had any respect for her position. That night, October 5th to 6th, the palace was surrounded. Thousands of people outside. Inside, the royal family tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. But everyone knew it was over. Whatever authority Versailles represented had evaporated. The spell was broken. Early morning, October 6th, some of the crowd broke into the palace. They found the queen's chambers. Marie Antoinette fled through hidden passages to the king's rooms. Guards fought the intruders. 2 guards were killed. Their heads were cut off and paraded on pikes. The violence was real now, not threatened, actual. Lafayette arrived with the National Guard. He'd followed the women's march from Paris, trying to maintain some order. He negotiated. The crowd wanted the royal family to return to Paris, to leave Versailles, to live among the people rather than isolated in a palace. Louis XVI agreed. What choice did he have? He couldn't defend Versailles against Paris. He couldn't escape. He couldn't use force without triggering massacre. So he surrendered. He appeared on a balcony with his family. The crowd jeered, demanded they come to Paris. By afternoon, the procession began. The royal family in carriages, surrounded by the crowd. National Guard trying to maintain order, wagons of grain that had been found at Versailles now being taken to Paris. The women who'd marched out walked back in triumph. They'd broken the palace. They'd forced the king to submit. Marie Antoinette reportedly looked back at Versailles as they left. Whether she understood she'd never return is unclear, but she was right to look back. This was the end. Not just of her time at Versailles, of Versailles as a seat of power. The palace that had controlled France for over a century was now empty. The court scattered. The nobles fled or followed the king to Paris. The servants remained, maintaining a building that no longer had purpose. Versailles had lost its function the moment the royal family was forced to leave. The symbolism was overwhelming. The palace built to make the king untouchable had become a trap. The system designed to prevent rebellions by controlling nobles had concentrated the royal family in one vulnerable location. When people stopped believing in royal authority, the palace became evidence against it. Every gold-leafed ceiling, every mirror-lined hall, every fountain that required elaborate engineering, all of it now looked like waste. The luxury that was supposed to inspire awe inspired rage instead. The spectacle that projected power revealed weakness. The National Assembly had already been transferring to Paris. The government functions moved with it. Versailles, which had been the center of French political life, became irrelevant overnight. Decisions were made in Paris now. At the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family was housed under house arrest, at the National Assembly meeting halls. Versailles was a museum of a dead system. The October days, as the march became known, marked the revolution's point of no return. The king had left Versailles under duress. The crowd had invaded the palace. Guards had been killed. The queen had fled for her life. You don't come back from that. The social contract was shredded beyond repair. For the monarchy, the symbolism was devastating. The palace Louis XIV built to concentrate power had concentrated the royal family in a vulnerable position. The court rituals that controlled nobles had become theatrical performances with no real authority. The luxury meant to impress had become evidence of exploitation. Versailles had done exactly what it was designed to do for a century. It trapped the aristocracy. It centralized power. It projected French glory. But it required belief to function. Once people stopped believing the king deserved absolute authority, once they stopped accepting that nobility was inherently superior, once they rejected the hierarchy Versailles enforced, the palace became an empty shell. The crowds that surrounded it in October 1789 didn't destroy Versailles with explosives or fire. They destroyed it psychologically. They showed that the magnificent palace couldn't protect the king from his own people, that all the gold and marble and ceremony meant nothing when people were hungry and angry enough. The women who marched weren't revolutionaries in an ideological sense. They were mothers and workers who couldn't feed their families. They didn't have a political program. They had a grievance. The system had failed them. The palace that consumed so much while they starved was the symbol of that failure. When they walked into Versailles, when they demanded to see the king, when they forced the royal family to leave, they weren't following a plan. They were reacting. But their reaction broke something that couldn't be repaired. It proved the palace was vulnerable, that the king was vulnerable, that the entire system of authority built on spectacle collapsed when tested by reality. The October days weren't the end of the revolution. Years of violence and upheaval followed. The constitutional monarchy failed. The republic was declared. The terror killed thousands. France would go through convulsions for years before stability returned. But the symbolic death of the monarchy happened in October 1789 when the king left Versailles. Everything after was aftermath. The structure was already broken. The foundation was already cracked. The spell was already shattered. Versailles sat empty. Guards remained to prevent looting. Maintenance workers kept the building from immediate decay. But no one lived there. No court gathered. No ceremonies happened. The machine that had run for over a century simply stopped. The National Assembly briefly considered what to do with it. Some proposed converting it to housing for the poor. Others suggested turning it into a hospital or school. A few wanted to demolish it entirely, remove the symbol of monarchy from existence. None of that happened. Partly because the revolution had bigger problems, the counter-revolution was gathering. War with other European powers was coming. Maintaining order in Paris was challenging enough. Versailles was abandoned but not destroyed, left to wait while France decided what it was becoming. The furniture and art were removed gradually. Some went to Paris museums, some was sold. The most valuable pieces disappeared into private collections. The palace interiors were stripped, leaving empty rooms that echoed where court ceremonies had once played out. The gardens fell into neglect. The fountains stopped flowing. Nobody maintained the elaborate plantings. Nature began reclaiming the geometric perfection that had cost so much to create. The statues weathered. The paths became overgrown. The triumph of human control over nature that André Le Nôtre had achieved started reversing. Versailles became a ghost, a monument to a dead system. Tourists could visit, wander the empty halls, imagine what it had been. But what it had been was gone. The power was in Paris now, with the convention, then the Directory, then Napoleon. Different systems, different ideas, but all centered in Paris, not Versailles. Napoleon briefly considered Versailles. He visited, thought about restoring it as an imperial palace, but he never followed through. He preferred other residences. Versailles was too associated with the Bourbons. Using it would have tied him to the old regime. Better to create new symbols of power. The restored Bourbon monarchy after Napoleon's fall didn't return to Versailles either. They stayed in Paris. Versailles had failed them once. Why go back? The palace was maintained but not occupied, a symbol kept but not trusted. The final transformation came under Louis Philippe in the 1830s. He converted Versailles into a museum dedicated to the glories of France. Not a residence, not a seat of government, a museum. The message was clear. This was history now. Past, finished. The museum preserved the architecture and art. It allowed people to see what had been. But in making it a museum, it acknowledged that what had been would never return. Versailles would never again be a living palace. It would be a monument to an ended era, which is exactly what it remains today. Millions visit annually. They walk through the Hall of Mirrors. They tour the royal apartments. They explore the gardens. They see the physical space where the French monarchy concentrated its power and wealth, and they see evidence of why that system collapsed. The luxury is overwhelming. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The scale is impressive, but it's also obviously excessive. Too much gold, too many rooms, too elaborate for any practical purpose. The beauty is undeniable. So is the waste. Modern visitors understand what 18th century French people eventually understood. This level of luxury, concentrated in one building, for one family and their court, while people outside were taxed and hungry, was indefensible. Not just economically, morally. The palace that was built to project eternal power became a warning about the limits of spectacle. You can build the most magnificent palace in the world. You can cover it in gold. You can create gardens that defy nature. You can concentrate all power in one location. But if the people paying for it stop consenting, it all falls apart. Versailles still stands because it was built too well to easily demolish. The materials were expensive. The construction was solid. Tearing it down would have required effort that France couldn't spare during revolution and war. So it survived. But it survived as something different than it was meant to be. The palace meant to make kings eternal became a museum of monarchy's failure. The building designed to concentrate power became evidence of power's limits. The luxury meant to inspire awe now inspires reflection on what happens when wealth and authority become too concentrated. Versailles haunts the world not because it's beautiful, though it is. Not because it's historically significant, though it is. It haunts because it's a warning about what happens when spectacle replaces substance, when image matters more than reality, when power becomes so obsessed with displaying itself that it forgets to justify itself. The palace still teaches lessons to anyone who looks closely, lessons about inequality, about the limits of control, about what happens when the gap between rich and poor becomes too wide to ignore, about the danger of systems that work by excluding rather than including. Modern politicians visit Versailles and see a cautionary tale. Modern citizens visit and see why revolutions happen. Modern students of power visit and learn that magnificence without legitimacy is just expensive furniture in an empty building. The October days of 1789 showed that a palace can't protect you when people stop believing in your right to rule. The years after showed that once legitimacy collapses, all the gold in the world won't restore it. The centuries since have shown that Versailles' real legacy isn't French glory or royal power. It's a lesson about what not to do. When power relies on spectacle, the spectacle becomes evidence against you. When authority depends on display rather than consent, display becomes your vulnerability. When a system exists to impress rather than serve, it creates the conditions for its own destruction. Versailles was meant to make the king untouchable. Instead, it made him visible, made his wealth visible, made his priorities visible, made the gap between his life and his subjects' lives impossible to ignore. The palace was supposed to protect the monarchy. It exposed the monarchy, revealed it as something built on inequality and maintained by force. The building still stands. But what it represented died in October 1789 when hungry women walked through rain to demand bread and ended up bringing down a system. The palace survived, the monarchy didn't. And the palace's survival serves mainly to remind anyone who visits that spectacle, isn't strength, visibility isn't power, and magnificence without justice eventually collapses under its own weight. That's the dark story of Versailles. Not a story of beauty or art or architectural achievement, though it's all of those. A story of how the most powerful palace in Europe became proof that power can destroy itself. How royal wealth became a curse, how spectacle became evidence, how magnificence became accusation. The palace was built to last forever. It has lasted, but as a monument to its own failure. As evidence that nothing lasts when it's built on foundations people eventually reject. As a warning that the most dangerous thing wealth can do is make itself visible when inequality is extreme. Versailles still stands. Walk through it. See the gold, the mirrors, the gardens. Then, remember the crowd at the gates, the women in the rain, the moment when all that magnificence couldn't protect the people inside from the people outside who'd paid for everything and received nothing. The palace was meant to make the king untouchable. Instead, it made him visible. And once people could see clearly, the spell was broken. The system collapsed, the monarchy fell, and Versailles became what it remains today. A beautiful, haunting reminder of what happens when power forgets that it exists by consent, when wealth displays itself without justifying itself, when spectacle replaces legitimacy. The palace endures, but what it represented is gone, and its survival serves mainly to teach the lesson its builders never intended. That magnificence without justice is just expensive decoration on a system waiting to collapse.